First story, The Eyes of Ashmore Asylum. It was a chilly November afternoon when I first heard about Ashmore Asylum. My friend Elliot had always been obsessed with urban legends. He insisted that we check out this abandoned hospital just outside Everett, Washington. According to him, the place had been shut down 20 years ago after a series of unexplained deaths. I didn't believe him. But the idea of exploring an old hospital sounded exciting. The building looked normal enough at first. Its red brick walls were worn, but the sign outside still read Ashmore Asylum, as if it had never been abandoned. Elliot, I entered through a broken door and found ourselves in a dusty lobby. Old chairs were scattered around, and a faded painting of a smiling doctor hung crooked on the wall. The air smelled of mold and something sour. As we wandered through the hallways, I felt uneasy. The place was eerily silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. Elliot was busy taking pictures when we heard it, a soft whisper coming from the end of the hall. We froze and looked at each other, both pretending we hadn't heard it. But the whisper came clearer this time. "Help me." We followed the sound to a room marked Ward B. Inside, the walls were covered in faded children's drawings. But what caught my eye was a figure in the corner. It was a child, or so I thought, huddled with its face hidden behind its knees. "Are you okay?" I asked hesitantly. The figure lifted its head slowly, revealing pale white eyes that stared straight through me. I stumbled back as the child stood up. Its skin was gray, and its movements were jerky, like a puppet on strings. It opened its mouth to speak, but instead, a horrible screech filled the room. Elliot grabbed my arm, and we bolted out of there as fast as we could. The hallways were different now. The paint was peeling off the walls, and the floor was littered with bones and broken medical equipment. The hospital was changing around us, trapping us inside. We could hear the screech echoing closer and closer. We finally found an exit and burst into the cold night air. When we looked back, the hospital was gone. In its place was an overgrown field with a single sign sticking out of the ground. Ashmore Asylum, closed since 1994. I don't know what we saw in there, but Elliot and I never spoke about it again. Sometimes, I still see those white eyes in my dreams, and they always whisper the same words, "Help me." Second story, Whispers of Starkwood Asylum. It was a rainy evening when I found myself driving through Starkwood, a small town in Maine, hidden deep in the woods. My car had broken down, and I was forced to seek shelter at the only building nearby, an abandoned hospital known as Starkwood Asylum. The asylum stood atop a hill, its windows dark and shattered, the walls covered in ivy, and its entrance barely visible through the mist. Legends said that Starkwood Asylum was shut down in the 1940s after a series of grisly murders committed by one of its patients. I never believed in urban legends, but something about the place felt wrong even before I stepped inside. I pushed open the rotting wooden door, and the smell of mildew and decay hit me like a wave. Inside, the hallways were lined with rusty beds, abandoned wheelchairs, and tattered medical records scattered across the floor. The air was cold, and every step I took echoed through the emptiness like a whisper. I was about to turn back when I heard it. A faint sound like a child giggling. It sent a chill down my spine, but I told myself it was just the wind. Then I heard it again, closer this time. "Hello?" I called out hesitantly. No response. I followed the sound down a dimly lit corridor, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The giggling led me to a room at the end of the hall. Inside was a dust-covered child's doll sitting on a chair. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and I was plunged into darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard it again, the giggling, but now it was right next to me. A small hand tugged at my jacket, and when I turned around, I saw her, a little girl with pale skin, hollow eyes, and a smile that stretched too wide. "Play with me," she whispered, her voice soft yet piercing. I bolted for the door, somehow forcing it open, and ran down the hallway. The giggling followed me, growing louder and more maniacal with each step. When I finally burst outside, the rain had stopped, and my car was now sitting perfectly fine on the road. I didn't question it. I jumped in and drove away as fast as I could. As I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw her standing at the asylum's entrance, waving at me. Her smile still etched on her face. I never spoke of Starkwood Asylum again, but every now and then, I hear that giggling in my dreams. Third story, The Whispers of St. Eleanor's. It was a stormy winter night when I found myself in Redwood Falls, a small town in Minnesota, famous for its abandoned St. Eleanor's Hospital. The place had always been shrouded in mystery and fear since it was shut down in the 1970s. I was a documentary filmmaker, and this hospital was my next project. People spoke of unexplainable occurrences and murmurs echoing through the empty halls even decades after it closed. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I was curious. The building stood at the edge of town, its stone walls weathered by time and neglect. The locals avoided it like the plague and warned me not to go inside. St. Eleanor's isn't just abandoned, it's cursed. An old man at the diner had told me. I brushed it off as small-town superstition. Inside the hospital, the air was heavy with dust and the stench of mold. My flashlight barely penetrated the darkness as I moved through the crumbling hallways. Faded paintings of saints hung crooked on the walls, and wheelchairs sat abandoned in corners, as if waiting for someone to return. I could hear the wind howling through broken windows and the creak of floorboards beneath my feet. As I set up my camera in what used to be the children's ward, I noticed a faint sound. It was a soft whisper, just barely audible over the howling wind. "Help me," it said. I froze and looked around but saw nothing. My heart pounded in my chest, but I convinced myself it was just the wind. Then I heard it again. This time, "Help me." The voice sounded like a child's, weak and desperate. I followed the sound down the hallway, my camera in hand. The whispers led me to room 217, a room that looked more intact than the others. Inside was a small bed with torn sheets and a rusty wheelchair beside it. The whispering stopped. As I stood there, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into darkness. I spun around, shining my flashlight on the door. But it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the room filled with a low humming noise. My flashlight began to flicker, and I felt a cold hand brush against my arm. I screamed and stumbled back against the wall. In the dim light, I saw the figure of a child standing by the bed, her face pale and expressionless. "Help me," she whispered again, reaching out toward me. Her eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to pull me in. Before I could react, the humming grew louder and the room began to spin. The last thing I remember was the child's cold hand gripping mine as everything went black. I woke up outside the hospital, my camera lying beside me. The footage was still intact. When I watched it later, I saw myself walking into room 217. But then the screen filled with static. When the image returned, I was lying outside the hospital, but in the corner of the frame. I could see her. The child stood in the window, watching me, smiling. People still warn me not to go back to St. Eleanor's. They say the hospital has a way of keeping a piece of you behind. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear her whispers. "Help me."